In tonight's episode, I'm going to be sharing with you 2 terrifying tales within the deep woods. But before we get into today's episode, be sure to go ahead and slap that subscribe button if you enjoy stories of the supernatural. Let's get into it. In the summer of 1976, I was living in Colorado Springs, Colorado, having moved there the year before from Florida. Back then, the population was only about a third of what it is now, 250,000 compared to almost 700,000 today. I've hiked many of the trails around Colorado Springs, and I've really enjoyed it. It is such beautiful mountainous scenery. It just makes you feel one with nature. So when my friend Terry suggested we go hiking up to Pikes Peak, I said sure. I had previously ridden the Cog Railroad to the top of Pikes Peak, where the elevation from 14,115 feet above sea level. You can even see the state of Utah. Of course, I took many pictures. He told me that the trail was around 26 miles long, 13 miles up and 13 miles down. He said we would start the routine in Manitou Springs, where the Cog Railroad begins, hike up to the bar camp and spend the night there. Then, finish the hike up to Pikes Peak summit the following day, walking back in the afternoon. We spent the rest of that day getting our gear together. I had to borrow another friend's backpack and sleeping bag, and we needed to go shopping for food. Snacks to eat along the trail and food for dinner and breakfast at camp. The next day, Penny, Terry's wife, drove us to the beginning of the trailhead in the springs around 9 a.m. I had no idea how hard it would be to walk the trail starting from there. The first 3 miles, of course, are at a 45-degree angle hike. I stopped countless times because my thighs were burning so bad. I told Terry several times that I did not know if I could continue. It was gruesome. It took almost 2 hours to walk those 3 miles. It was good that we brought a lot of water with us because the summertime temps in Colorado Springs can get relatively high, particularly on Pikes Peak. After all, the trailhead is located more than 6,000 feet above sea level. Taking huge mouthfuls of air or water was difficult while trying not to fall backward or forwards. But after those first 3 miles, the trail does ease up and is on much more level ground, even though you are still hiking upward. After a couple more hours into our journey, I remember thinking how beautiful nature really can be. I had asked Terry if there were any animals around here like bears or cougars. He simply laughed and said, if there are any, they are more afraid of you. He then added, hey, let's stop here and rest because it is only about another hour's walk where we will spend the night at a campsite. So I said, okay, my legs could use rest. We both sat down a little way off the trail on some logs resting from our hike. We ate some lunch and then packed up the remains of our food, water bottle, etc. before heading back to the bar campground, a site set up for people who want a place to stay overnight while hiking the Pikes Peak Trail. We arrived at the camp around 4 p.m. and were greeted by 2 camp staff members who told us we could pick any of the empty rooms to use for the night. This is due to we were the only hikers there. At the campground is a building with rooms that have bunk beds with mattresses. We picked a room in the cabin that had 2 bunk beds. I took the bottom, Terry took the top. We put away our sleeping bags and gear and went back outside, where a campfire was going. The camp staff make sure there is always a fire going in case people want to cook something. 4 more hikers came into the camp around 5 o'clock. They too were spending the night there before taking off in the morning to hike the summit. We all cooked our food on the campfire that night as we socialized and tried to sing campfire songs. That was hilarious because nobody really knew any, so we made up songs that kept the evening upbeat. Everybody went to bed early. I knew that I was more tired than expected and I fell asleep fast. I was awakened during the night by a loud crashing noise right outside our room window. I looked up toward the window and there was this tall, hairy figure. It seemed to be looking at the bunk above me where Terry had slept, and then it looked back down at my face as it realized that I must have seen him also. I immediately jumped out of bed without any thinking about what might happen if I move or say anything. I yelled Terry's name and noticed that he was already awake. We both look at each other, realizing we both just saw the same thing. As Terry fumbled through his gear to grab his flashlight he had brought, I noticed that the others in the bunkhouse were up and standing in their doorways with a look on their faces that said it all. One of them had a flashlight in his hand. We all then headed for the cabin's front door, threw open the door to see outside. With 2 lights pointing in all directions, the 6 of us stood there, trying to see in the dark woods, looking for whatever this thing was. Apparently, it had peered into the other rooms before it looked into my own, because they said they saw something too. Then, as if on cue, all of us said, "Pew, what is that smell?" A smell then began lingering throughout the camp, like a strong aroma unlike anything I had ever smelled before. Rotten eggs mixed with rotting meat, gaggingly bad. We were too shocked to yell or scream, so we stayed frozen, staring at each other in disbelief. In an instant, one of the flashlights shone on a tall, dark figure standing off in the distance. It immediately fled into the dense forest darkness and was too thick for us to see anymore. Was it still lurking about watching us? The thought frightened me more. We all went back inside the cabin and tried to get some rest. I could not sleep, nor could my friend Terry. We'd sat most of the time, talking about what had happened and trying to keep everybody else calm. But they were still pretty nervous since no one had ever been in such an experience camping before. At least I had not, and I didn't think the others had either. We didn't know how it would end, and because none of us knew anything like this had ever happened, things were even more alarming. But deep down, everybody was happy that something crazy and exciting had occurred. Out here, deep in the woods, where people usually never visit except during summer. Everybody laughed after being emotionally scarred from seeing something so unbelievable that something actually existed there for real, and we saw him. The following day, everyone in the cabin was up early. While cooking breakfast, we all talked about what happened but did not linger, because we had all planned to hike up to the top of Pikes Peak. It wasn't long before we all decided to hike up as a group. Maybe it was for safety's sake, but I felt better with that decision. The morning hike was beautiful, and after a couple of hours of hiking through these dense woods, we came to the edge of a tree line. This is where the trees stop growing because of elevation, and the landscape turns into small brush, then nothing but rocks and boulders. Now, out from under the shadows of the trees into the bright sunshine, the air felt warm, but not hot, so we all stopped for a snack break. While sitting there, I began to smell that awful smell again. At first, I thought it was the scent that was still in my nostrils from last night, and the open air had somehow brought it back. But then I noticed the others making faces as they too smelt what I did. I looked around but did not see anything. But one of the other hikers yelled, "There it is!" Looking to where he was pointing, we saw a large, dark-haired figure standing still among the boulders off to our right-hand side across from us, in some dense brush. That is when it started walking slowly back down toward the tree line area back into the woods, concealing itself completely from view. We all ran over to the spot where we saw it enter the tree line, hoping to get another look at this thing and maybe it would come out again. However, nothing happened. So we began to look on the ground for footprints. Even though it was rugged terrain, we had partial success finding bare footmarks followed by a trail left behind due to vegetation crushed under its feet. That led down to where we saw it enter the woods. And let me tell you, we were all excited by this. I only wish one of us would have had a camera and taken a picture. Well, after that, we continued on our way up to the summit. We stopped again at the A-frame to eat lunch about 3 miles from the top. Once we get to the top of Pikes Peak, the group broke up. Because we did not get much sleep the previous night, Terry and I decided we felt too tired to hike back down the 13 miles. Instead, we took the Cog Railroad back down. When we got home, I had trouble sleeping for days on end. I guess insomnia and anxiety attacks are common after an encounter. After a few days, things did return to normal. Yet, I often still think about what had happened. It usually comes up in conversation with other campers or hikers who have gone or will themselves into that area. I'm still not sure what this creature was. I've seen many documentaries on Bigfoot, but nothing shows them exactly like he appeared or even behaved toward us. I've not heard of any more sightings occurring in my area again, but now I know it's out there. Story 2. Many reports of UFO sightings and related phenomena occur in the night sky. While an encounter with a flying object is not necessarily a close encounter of the third kind, most close encounters involve at least one object seen in the sky. In the early to mid 20th century, the term flying saucer was often used to describe a UFO. In 1947, private pilot Kenneth Arnold gained national attention after claiming to have seen 9 disc-shaped objects flying in perfect formation near Mount Rainier, Washington. This event is often cited as the beginning of the modern UFO era. A public awareness of the phenomenon increased. More and more reports of sightings were made, and in the late 1940s and early 1950s, a wave of flying saucer sightings occurred in the United States, which came to be known as the flying saucer flap. This was a period of intense UFO activity, reports of sightings coming from all over the country. At the height of the flap, the U.S. Air Force began an investigation into the phenomenon known as Project Blue Book. From 1947 to 69, the Air Force investigated more than 12,000 UFO reports, but could not find a satisfactory explanation for most of them. As the flying saucer craze began to die down in the late 50s, reports of UFO sightings continued. In the 60s and 70s, there was a renewed interest in UFOs, partly sparkled by the release of the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. This film, directed by Steven Spielberg, tells the story of a group of people who have a close encounter with a UFO. In the decades since the film's release, reports of sightings have continued to be made. While most of these reports can be explained, a small number remain unexplained. A close encounter of the third kind is an encounter in which a human witnesses an entity or entities. The most famous is the encounter that is said to have taken place in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. In the early morning of July 7, 1947, a father named Mac Brazel discovered strange debris in a field on his ranch. He contacted the local sheriff, who notified the Roswell Army Airfield, and personnel from the RAAF soon arrived at the scene and began to collect the debris. They also found him and took him into custody, interrogating and accosting him about what he had seen. The RAAF issued a press release stating that they had recovered a flying disc from the crash site. This press release quickly made its way worldwide and sparked a media frenzy. The RAAF soon backtracked on its initial statement, claiming that the debris was actually from a weather balloon. The case was quickly forgotten and remained dormant for decades to come. Now, in the late 1970s, a man named Stanton Friedman began investigating the Roswell incident. Friedman, a nuclear physicist, interviewed a number of people involved in the case, including Brazel's daughter and the sheriff who had initially investigated the incident. Friedman's investigation led him to believe that the RAAF and recovered an extraterrestrial spacecraft from the crash site alone, and that bodies of the aliens aboard the ship have been taken to a secret government facility. Friedman's claims sparked a renewed interest in the Roswell incident, which has since become the most famous UFO case in history. Most UFO sightings can easily be explained as a natural phenomena or man-made objects. However, a small number of sightings remain unexplained. That's where my story comes in. It involves 2 men and their encounter in the swamps of Florida with aliens, or was it? The men, who wished to remain anonymous, was driving through the Big Cypress National Preserve in Florida. That's when they said they saw something strange in the sky that evening. They pulled over to get a better look, and things got even more bizarre. Above them in the sky appeared what looked like 7 rings of clouds, one on top of the other. Each ring cloud was a different color as well. According to their account, they saw a cigar-shaped object the size of a football field coming out from the center of the clouds and began hovering above the swamp. It was emitting a bright light and made no noise. Then, this cigar-shaped object landed in the swampy waters. One of the men explained that it almost seemed to float on the surface of the water. They could see portals running along the side of the craft. The outlets resembled windows, only they did not look like they were made of glass, more like aluminum, yet see-through. They saw creatures that resembled lizard men moving around inside the craft. The men said they felt compelled to approach, even though they were terrified. It's as if they were being drawn. As they got closer, they described the creatures as being about 7 feet tall. They could see that the beings had large eyes and green skin. Then, they noticed that the lizard men were looking directly at them. That's when a sound that began with a low hum began to get their attention. The sound seemed to get higher in frequency, and that's when they saw an opening in the front of the craft. Some sort of platform was being lowered into the swampy ground. As the platform touched the surface of the water around the platform evaporated, and the land was instantly dry in all directions for a radius of about 5 feet. That's when 2 of these beings came out of the craft. They did not walk out. They just seemed to float down the ramp. Each one was wearing what looked like a harness in front of their bodies attached to a small pack on their back. And as they stepped onto the ground and began to walk toward the men, the ground below the creature's feet instantly became dry, just like the platform. These beings did not speak, but the men said they could hear telepathic voices from in their heads. It was like a computerized voice saying, "Do not be afraid, we come in peace." Then the creatures reached out and touched the men's head. The next thing they remember, they were wide awake in what seemed to be an operating room. Everything in that environment appeared a brilliant white color and sterile. They were not lying on a table as one might expect to find in an operating room. Instead, both men were lying on a beam of white light. Their entire body appeared to be glowing. When they looked at each other, they both said they almost had the impression they could see through their bodies, as if their flesh and everything in them had somehow become translucent. There were several beings surrounding each of them at this time. The beings informed them that they had been chosen. The beings said that there was much negativity and hatred. The men were then shown images of different events happening around the world. They saw wars, natural disasters, and poverty to extreme. They were then told they needed to help the beings spread their message of peace and love to those on Earth, and help make the world a better place. The beings then told the men that they needed to implant a device in their bodies to track them and communicate with them any time would be necessary. The next thing they remember is waking up in their car, parked along the side of the road. They have no memory of how they got there or what happened to these beings. They only know that it is now nighttime and were very confused. The men say they have no memory of the implantation process, but they both have a small scar on their neck they could not explain. A small implant device was discovered in both men when they were examined by a doctor. Both men had the device surgically removed, which was the size of a grain of rice, almost like a little BB. These implants are the only thing that validates their story, and both men have had dreams or visions of different events happening around the world. The men say that they are unsure if the beings were aliens or angels, but they believe they were sent to help spread a message of peace and love. Who's to say what these men encountered that night? UFO, angel, or alien? It is an amazing story, that's for sure.